Hi everyone. Do we have drama? Do we have intrigue? Do we have woulda, coulda, shouldas and thoughts that I'm sure a lot of the players are experiencing right now at the candidates in Moscow as round 13 comes to its conclusion? Yes, we do. We have all of those things, and it was a very, very long day, 7+ hours for the players as far as their moves on the board, a day that was just as long for me and my team. That's not grandstanding, that's just the truth as far as Peter Docker's news report, MVL, and Robert Hess's analysis, and now this video, finally getting to it after feeling prepared enough to deliver the educational goods to you. So don't go anywhere. It's going to be a jam-packed, who knows how long the video will be, probably at least 40+ minutes as we break down the action of all of these games. I'm going to do my best to make you feel like you're really taking something home. And right at the top, we start right there as far as woulda, coulda, shouldas, right? Veselin Topalov loses with white to Hikaru Nakamura, but if you're Nakamura right now, after winning another game, this time a very big win as black after beating Vichy previously, you got to be thinking you're only really a full point behind the leaders after basically having been out of the tournament. What would have happened if the tournament had started off on a better foot for Hikaru? Not really for us to speculate. It's for us to review that game and show you what happened. Moving on to the next game, of course, we had Vishy Anand. And if you want to talk woulda, coulda, shouldas today, Anish Giri went for his first win in peace sacrifice style. First time we've seen Giri do that, and the sacrifice should not have worked, but Anand was unable to fully gather himself and get the full point, which would have him tied for the lead right now. Oh my gosh, are you going to enjoy this game? And then moving on to the game that was 7+ hours, the game that was just as deserving of game of the day, but we had to give Maxime something to do. That's MVL. Fabiano Caruana was unable to win in a theoretically winning position. The Philidor Win, of course, just about every winning endgame is named after Philidor, right? Who is that guy, by the way? I'm just kidding. I know who he was. One of the first chess theoreticians. But you're going to learn something about the Rook and Bishop versus Rook ending. If you didn't know anything about it beforehand, make sure you have your pen and paper out, because seriously, I had to go over like 7 times before I knew exactly where Fabiano could have won. Heartbreaking for the American not to come away with the full point. But moving on to the game of the day, he's not out of it yet because Levon Aronian was unable to convert against Sergey Karjakin, but he also didn't lose. That means we have Levon Aronian getting a half point against Sergey Karjakin. You really have to give credit to the Russian who, when feeling the pressure from Levon Aronian, managed to flip the tables, as he has done so many times in this tournament, where he was under the gun and found a way to put the pressure back on his opponent to find the most accurate moves, and that is why he was able to hold that game. So I know I just talked for 2-3 minutes just previewing the games, but that's because I'm that excited and because I'm that jacked up after reviewing these games. It's going to be a lot of fun. So let's jump right in. And there's no reason for me to preview it anymore because we have games to get to, people. Starting off, let's start off with the most exciting game of the day if you want to talk what the results were. This was the only decisive game of the round, as you already know, with Hikaru Nakamura taking down Veselin Topalov. We had D4. Hasn't been played that many times in this tournament, right? We've seen so many Englishes. We've now seen the E4 Italian game more times than we thought we'd have to count. So the move 1D4 has not been that popular, as was noted actually in the interview with Peter Dockers and Hikaru Nakamura, which you can check out in the candidates playlist. Although it did transpose to something we have seen a few times, of course, this just being a potential for a Nimzo Indian or Queen's Indian. But Hikaru says, I've had enough of that Queen's Indian stuff. It didn't go well against Karjakin. I'm just going to transpose to a QGD. And here we go. We see normal developing moves. QGD, of course, being Queen's Gambit decline for all the beginners out there. Very common stuff. And after A3, C5, Hikaru is actually repeating what he did as black against Magnus Carlsen at the Singfield Cup last year. A game that did not go very well for him, counting the opening stage to the middle game. A game that he did eventually draw after Magnus misplayed the endgame. But Hikaru must have had an improvement, or Veselin Topalov was not ready to challenge it, because after knight to C6 here, Veselin decided just to take on D5. Didn't even attempt to repeat what Carlsen did, which of course was with 9 queen to c2. And after queen to a5, if you want to see that game, go ahead and check out the analysis over at the news report, because we have too much to get to, not enough time to sit here and spend too much time on a game that it doesn't really make any theoretical difference here. C takes d5, C takes d5, and guess what we have? An IQP, baby, right? We've seen this before, everybody. I've talked about what both sides want, but it's definitely a dynamic game, and of course you expect white to just develop the pieces here and play bishop to e2, or even bishop to d3. What we're going to get after bishop to e2 is moves like rook to e8 and castles, and we have the basic IQ struggle, right? The person with the pawn wants activity, wants square control, and to avoid minor piece exchanges, and white pretty much wants the opposite so that he can focus in on this weakness. But for some reason, Topalov, who has just not played his best chess this tournament, decided to play the ultra risky move 10b4, which as Grandmaster Robert Hess said in the analysis at the news report, it hasn't been played that often for white, and that's because it's not very good, and because it just allows black so many options, including the crazy move knight takes b4. But Hikaru played the most simple move that makes you wonder why it hasn't been played as the most popular option here for black, and that's just d4. You counteract one pawn move with another, but the difference is that black's move is much more principled here. Why is that? Because white's king is not in the center. We always hear the phrase, get castled before move 10. Well, how do you punish somebody if they haven't gotten their king out of the center? You blow it open. And that's what he's doing with d4. After e takes d4, bishop takes d4, and the exchange happens, Black is bringing the pressure to the e-file. There really aren't many other options for white other than what happened in the game with bishop to e3. Knight e2 is noted as an idea, but even just the simple knight goes back to e6 is probably good enough for black to be better. How are you developing the king side before I bring the heat? It's not obvious, and it just makes you wonder why Topalov played b4. Where was the prep? Is he making it up? FIDE Master Mike Klein said in this week's Chess Center, and I'm just remembering that now, that Topalov has admitted to just not feel very well prepared in terms of being compared to his other 27, 60-plus peers these days. And maybe his age or just lack of really hitting the books hard is showing, because Topalov has just not had very good positions out of the openings in this tournament. He plays bishop to e3, but after knight f5, the point is that even the queen trade can't really save white from being worse. After the exchange happens, you can again note the interview by Peter Dockers where Hikaru said that maybe this makes even more sense to put the pressure before the king castles, but I'm not going to hold it against the American, because after takes and knight to g4, white just already has tough problems, because the e-pawn is not only the only isolated pawn on the board, meaning black has no structural weaknesses, but taking doesn't really help white. And when you get positions like this, the point is the bishop is so much better than the knight in these positions where the center is open, there's pawns on both sides of the board, and even just the concrete factors, like you can't castle because you might lose more material right away, right? Well, if you can't castle, how do you deal with this, right? Do you put the rook on c1? Well, black just keeps bringing the heat, and the threat of rook to d3 is renewed. So white just has problems here all around, and after the move knight to g4 was played, Veselin decided to hold on to the pawn, which makes sense, but here comes natural moves, and you love it when natural moves just put your opponent under a ton of pressure, right? You know what they say about pigs at a buffet, right? They say, those things look like rooks. LOL. I literally just made up that joke right now. Pigs at a buffet look like rooks. That's what they look like when they're on the 7th rank, and the rook can't even be challenged here. This is not a fun position for Veselin. Bishop f3, the other rook comes over, e5. Now, after b6, black is just in control of all the critical squares. You're just preventing threats. No point in going for anything complicated. Knight to e4, rook to b2, not because you can bring the rook in right away, but because you have other places for the rook to go, like maybe to d4. Maybe you can find other ways to poke at the queenside pawns. So white plays rook to e1, knight to c4, and after knight to g5, h6, takes. The point again is that the rooks to c1 is just not effective enough because the rook comes to d4. And what's interesting is you may look at this position and think, how is black just so much better here, right? I mean, normally whenever I see these grandmasters play endgames, they just get a draw if the material is still equal and this many pieces have come off the board. But normally you don't see one player in control of every critical access point, right? You have black controlling the 7th rank. You have black controlling the only open file. You have black targeting the only potential pawn weaknesses on the board. Now, this pawn is on a light square, but the bishop doesn't really have time to go after it. So with best play and not that much material on the board, are there always chances for the defender to draw? Of course there are. But don't be surprised sometimes when chess looks really simple at a high level, where one side gets a bad opening, it's just on their heels from the start, and you're like, why can't I just trade to an endgame where if I could just play with that many pieces on the board, chess would be easy to convert on small advantages? Well, yeah, it would be nice if your opponent doesn't have counterplay like this. After h3 to free the back rank, black plays b5 just to fix the pawns and to maybe open some more squares for the knight. Rook to c3 is played. Noted by Grandmaster Robert Hess that Rook a1 was another way for white to go, but after some moves like this, black ends up winning the pawn and then playing a5, keeping these two pawns sort of isolated as targets. Go ahead and check out the analysis if you wish, and see that black is still the only one pushing there. After rook to c3, rook comes into d2, a4, trying to undermine the knight. Black says, well, I have another pawn, in case you forgot. Bishop to b7 is met by knight to d5. The threat here is knight to b6, because the threat is knight to d5. And you also can't take because the pigs go to work over there in the buffet, right? You know how they feel about them salads. You know, the all-you-can-eat salad with where they really got the good stuff, like the cheese and the hard-boiled eggs. You know what I'm talking about. After a takes b5, bishop b4, Topalov has to sit because again he's afraid of knight to d5 and the rook coming over. But now the knight comes back to c4, hitting e5. And a few more natural moves show that simplification is going to kill the cat in this case. Black has to activate, and Topalov does what all good players do, make it look messy right before the end is nigh. You ever notice that, how they're about to resign, but to you as the viewer, it looks like the position's still crazy? Well, White created a whole bunch of checks and threats, but the truth is the rooks on the 7th rank and pawns were just too much for White to deal with. Even with the most accurate moves, Black was pressing and better in maybe different versions of a similar endgame. Even in the rook endings, Black had all the winning chances. Please check out Robert's analysis if you want to look into more, but the most instructive points were that White didn't finish his development, didn't get castled before Black blew open the center. White did not take a principled approach to the isolated pawn. Black punished him for it, never looked back, and after bishop takes e6, knight f4, Topalov simply resigned. The bishop is being attacked, and we're threatening to take here. Moves like bishop here run into all kinds of problems. The simplest, if you're into that kind of thing, is we can just take it and go get this pawn, and again, Black's going to end up being 2 pawns in the endgame pretty easily winning, and that was our only decisive game. So again, woulda, coulda, shouldas for Hikaru Nakamura. Another pretty simple win. First time he's really had even a desirable position as Black out of the opening in the Candidates tournament, to be totally honest. But we're going to move on to the next game, the game that was just as much fun. It didn't end in a decisive result, but Vishy Anand's position against Giri may be one that haunts him if he doesn't end up winning the Candidates tournament. And indeed, we do have indeed. Did I just say indeed instead of indeed? And indeed. Well, thanks, Dan. And in too exhausted to be saying words correctly. We have another Italian. And indeed, we have another Italian, which has just been funny because it's not something you've seen at the highest levels very often. But now everybody and their cousin seems to be going for the Italian system. You know, you end up reaching very similar anti-Berlin positions where White has d3 early. Think of the 4d3 anti-Berlin, and then flexibility in the center with c3. So I'm going to make the prediction that shouldn't be that hard to agree with at this point, just given that we've now seen the best players in the world all play each other for this double round robin, and we've seen the Italian enough times, 4 or 5 times, right? I think we're going to keep seeing it. I think it offers White flexibility. Again, at this stage of opening theory and computer preparation, all these players really want is the opportunity to outplay their opponent, which is why a lot of them play the 4d3 anti-Berlin, right? And they don't go for the main lines. They don't want the most forcing lines that everybody with the most powerful engine has mapped out. They want opportunities to outplay their opponent and to have a flexible position where there are different stylistic options, right? And that's what the Italian offers. So we should have seen this coming, and it's not a big surprise we see it again. A4, bishop to b7. Already noted should be that Giri as White against Anand at the Zurich Chess Challenge just a couple months ago played castles. And then in the main line, we had the structure you reach here. I believe I quoted this game in analysis I did in one of Peter's previous reports for the tournament. But this structure is something you see a lot, where Black has the double pawns, but of course for it, the compensation on the F-file. This is a very typical Italian type position, so you can go ahead and take a picture of it with your face camera. Right? Go ahead and do that for me. If you literally just did that alone, just please go talk to your wife or something. Spend some time with another human being for my sake, okay? Because I'm not alone, I'm talking to you, but don't start doing things like that without me around, all right? It worries me about you. All right, so bishop a7 is played by Black instead to keep a little more flexibility by Giri. after knight to a3, knight e7. Of course, you remember this position as played by Vishy versus Levon Aronian a few rounds earlier, where I thought Vishy was on his way to just run away with the tournament. He played knight to c2 against the Armenian, and remember we had that endgame where I highlighted the point that that white had small advantages that black was going to have a hard time dealing with. When you had, remember the endgame that happened with b6, and the knights got traded, the bishops got traded, and it felt like everything was equal, but all of a sudden Vishy was able to push and push and push, and Aronian ended up messing up the rook ending. Really critical to talk about when you had the only control over creating space and those things. So really good lesson Vishy taught us that game, but he decided for some reason he doesn't have enough to repeat that, or was just worried about what Giri and his team of seconds might have come up with. And so he blinked first, right? He went Kevin Bacon on this when he had his shoe caught to the tractor and footloose and tried to get away, but turns out he was just caught to the tractor, had to keep going. I don't know where that reference makes sense. Anyway, he varied first. He played bishop to g5, pinning the knight to the queen and playing a natural developing move. After c6, we get our first really actually instructive moment without me reaching on pop culture references. Why is bishop takes f6 not very good for white? This is something that I think a lot of amateurs, 1800 and below, would be really served to understand here, because it seems so natural. Let's look at it. To take f6 and to have the doubled pawns here and to think, how can this not be the right way for white to go? But what you realize is that actually black is in control of every possible plan. Black has the g file, which may work well with the bishop. The bishop on this diagonal, also putting pressure, will prevent white from doing anything too quickly with things like f4, try to open up squares toward the pawns. And the fact that black has f5 even with the pawn. The pawns are not going to be doubled for very long, and if you play f5 and if you take it either way, I'm going to recapture with a piece that'll come to the king side. I don't know that I'm going to be castling long, but I probably could if I need to. And it's like a Sveshnikov. When a lower rated player first learns the Sveshnikov and they see that doubled pawns are a weakness, of course, unbiasedly. If you just said, let's take all the pieces off the board right now, what does the forest through the trees tell us? It tells us that black is worse in the endgame because of doubled pawns and the isolated h-pawn. But you can't just liquidate all of the dynamic obstacles in the way and get to the endgame, right? And along the way, black has all the counterplay. So that was kind of instructive, and I think that was part of Giri's preparation to play c6 and try to invite the trade. It also showed us that Giri was in the mood for a fighting game, which was cool to see if you were watching it live, right? Enough Giri jokes for the day. Actually, not enough. I have many more to come. Again, after knight h4, it still shows you that bishop takes f6 is actually just not the right approach, because there isn't enough to take advantage of the king and the f-pawns right away. And once again, we will see black use the g-file, black use the open lines, and probably black play for f5 at some point. So again, bishop takes f6, not a real option. Instead, Vishy builds on the pressure with knight h4, d5. After takes, he takes with the pawn. Now, I have to say, I totally agree with Robert Hess's analysis here. He said that c takes d5 made more sense for Giri, and why not? After bishop a2, bishop g4, and then bishop h5. Is he worried about white taking here all of a sudden, even though he hasn't been worried the whole time? Tell me that you don't like the beautiful pawns in the center and this bishop developed with the pin. I don't really understand, and the computer doesn't either, right? I have a big lizard friend next to me, and he helps me. He's strong. He doesn't understand why c takes d5 isn't the best option for black either. So go figure. Giri decided to take with the knight, like those chances for whatever reason. After knight f3, queen d6, rook e1, bishop g4, all these moves pretty much make sense. Bishop to h4 is actually a very useful move to take note of, because sometimes when your bishops are, I don't want to say misplaced, but they become empty. Remember when we talked about how there are two types of bad bishops in chess, right? There's the classical bishop everyone, even a beginner, recognizes as bad, right? The bishop that is blocked behind all of its own pawns. Imagine a whole bunch of pawns blocking a poor bishop on d7. Everyone knows that that bishop is lacking in mobility. But the other type of bad bishop is an empty piece, right? A purposeless piece. And when the knight is no longer pinned on f6, how many times in your own games have you left that piece there and either traded it eventually to give up the bishop pair, or something else bad happens because you didn't take the time to recognize that one of your pieces was not optimally placed. You have to recognize whether all of your pieces are doing what they need to do for the structure in the position. The pawns are the backbone. They're your skeletal structure. They're the ones that can't change. Are all of your pieces in their most effective spots to take advantage of the squares and the pawns and the open diagonals and files that are available? That's what bishop h4 does, is it's an attempt to relocate the bishop to a much more purposeful position, which is to put pressure on the only possible target in black's camp. So I like those moves just from an instructive standpoint because it's a move that amateurs are like, grandmasters always play the weirdest moves. And then I explain it and you're like, oh, actually, well, hopefully that'll be something I think of from now on, right? Hope so. I got to drink some water here for a second because if you can't tell, I'm a little bit cottonmouth, talking a little too fast. So bishop h4 is played, and that's exactly the reason why it's coming to g3, just like this. After rook to e8, h3, bishop comes to g3, knight f4, which of course makes sense for black to not allow the e-pawn to be ganged up on too much. And after takes, and then d4, I was starting to like Vichy. I felt like the knight f4 was a small concession despite the bishop pair being lost. Of course, d4, if your white prepares your own plan to make this bishop empty, which is to play queen up to d3, unpin the knight, put the pony on e5, and see what happens. But Giri wasn't interested in letting that happen. Giri was ready to be aggressive and to stay aggressive this whole game, actually. He plays c5, which makes total sense. You're trying to pry open the bishop that has been blocked out. Bishop comes to e2, we get a trade. And after the big exchange, black puts pressure on the c-file, which has a concrete threat. If you want to pause your video and take a mo to see what's going on, you can. I'm going to take here. And after knight takes, I'm going to take again, and your pawn is pinned. So Vichy plays the move rook to d1 to defend it, and after takes f3, knight takes f3. Probably bishop takes f3 is not a good idea because I think of rook takes d4, and if rook takes, bishop takes, and we still got a bunch of pin problems. So knight takes makes sense, and now this is where we really knew Giri came for the he was swinging for the fences today, which is an American reference I only pray the boy gets. Just kidding. No, I'm sure he gets it. He was going for it today, and probably played the move that he should have lost in the game, despite the fact that it was given an exclam by Robert Hess in the analysis. I mean, the truth is it doesn't pack enough punch to really deliver the goods if white had calculated accurately. The simple approach, queen to b6, putting pressure on the f2 pawn, and after bishop to d3, rook takes g6, positions roughly equal. I prefer black. His opposite-coded bishop has a little bit more of a permanent target than white's does. Is it likely a draw because of that term I just said, opposite-coded bishops? Yes, it is. But that's probably what the best, most unbiased approach is. Bishop takes f2 is played in the game. Giri said, go big or go home. He took on f2, got to risk it to get the biscuit. I'm tired of these draws. Queen to b6 check. And after king to f1, plays the move knight to h5, threatening checkmate, right? He actually started screaming to Hikaru, who was next to him. He was like, knight, oh wait, we're not playing Bughouse? Whoa, right? No, I'm kidding. No, of course, if he had a knight and he dropped it on g3, that would have been checkmate. All of a sudden, he remembers we're not playing Bughouse, and he regrets the whole thing. In all seriousness, if Anand had tried to stop the mating attack with rook to d4, we would see this idea of the c-file coming back into play, so just wanted to point that out. This would be a good endgame for black. So instead, after king f1, knight to h5 threatens mate because Giri realizes he's not actually playing Bughouse. And the move g4 is played for white. A really nice move that opens up the square, makes knight g3 check, nothing but a check, and probably should have been enough to win. It should be noted that rook to d4 was actually possible now. The difference from before is that if you just take everything, the bishop is hitting the knight in the end, so you have to be careful. But after knight to g3 and then takes d4, we could get this weird endgame where I think Vichy probably dismissed it, fearing the knight and rook together. They do work very well in creating mating nets. But white actually had this crazy forcing line from the computer. Bishop takes a6, threatening mate on e8. Then you get b7. And in the end of this line, I would probably prefer black. Also, again, with the rook and the knight, if I don't see the a-pawn running too quickly. But probably the position is dynamically equal. So that might have held for white as well, but Vichy wanted more than just a hold, which is why he played g4, because it should be winning. And after takes g3, he played bishop d3. Now again, here, finally, rook d4 is possible, and for the first time, it's probably good. We've seen it be losing, we've seen it be a draw, and here it was probably good. What's the difference? Well, again, the knight is hanging, but here black doesn't have the intermezzo of knight to g3 check, saving the pony. So if you just take on d4 and take again, I take on h5. And you couldn't save that knight with the in-between move. So maybe you give some sort of check, I move the king, and you have no clear way to win back the piece or to keep the attack going. White is probably just easily winning. So how Vishy didn't play rook to d4, I don't know what he was scared of. But again, if this candidates is not his tournament to win, if he doesn't win his last game, we'll get into that in a minute, he may really be regretting not refuting Giri's sacrifice for a full point. So rook to d4 was possible. Instead, he played bishop d3, and now after exchanging knight f4, knight to d4, g6, this is really the last chance where Vishy had an opportune moment to win this position up a piece. Remember, black has 2 pawns currently for the piece, which is close, and still has practical pressure. So if you're not able to find the concrete defensive approach in those situations, often your opponent will get something more for the piece, whether that's a third pawn, whether it's lasting pressure on your king, whatever it is. So you really want to be accurate and be willing to play risky moves. Here, Vishy played the move bishop to e4, but the move rook to e3 was the key. After queen to f6, the key is queen to d2, and there are no good discovered checks. I know you have to take a picture again with your face camera and be like, what? There's no good discovered checks here? No, but there's not. There's no good checks with the knight because no matter what you do, even if you take a piece, we have an intermezzo. Rook f3, gaining a tempo on the queen. We only then gobble up the knight, deal with the checks, and in the end with everybody falling, black is actually losing if he keeps trying to take pawns because of a brilliant, again, this is partly computer prep, hard to blame Vishy for not seeing this, but knight f5 is an exclam of viach. Boom, in your face. I'm threatening queen e5, and now you shall lose. So if you take it, here comes the checks town. Check town, mate town. So crazy line, but it does show how quickly the script can be flipped. Okay, if you're a professional rapper, the script can be flipped often. And unfortunately for Giri, Vishy, he's not a professional rapper. He did not flip the script. Played bishop e4, and after queen f6, bishop f3 blocking this way was not enough. Black is able to get some counterplay, exactly the kind of counterplay he needs to get the rook for the 2 pieces. You think that white still has a tiny edge, the 2 pieces for the rook, but there's not enough targets for the pieces to outplay the rook, in addition to the fact that white's king is wide open. So after a whole bunch of tickle, some complicated moves, the bottom line is that white had to put pressure on the only critical weakness here, and black was forced to bail out with a perpetual, but really neither side had serious chances to win. Note if the king runs too far, the black queen sort of sneaks behind. If the king stays, then the checks continue. And as we've seen, if the queen can just sit on a7, then white can't really trade everything either, because then white will lose the king and pawn ending. So quite the mess. Quite the opportunity lost if you are the former world champion to get back to that rematch. I'm going to guess that this was pretty much his swan song, and that I wouldn't be surprised if him and Svidler actually take a very fast draw in the final round. But again, we'll get to that soon. Unfortunate for Vishy, very close, but let's get into the second game of the day, right? Game of the day 1B instead of 1A, and that was between Fabiano Caruana and Peter Svidler. Now, most of the instructional meat of this game is actually taking place in the endgame, so we're going to work through this Ruy Lopez. No Berlin. D3 is played, though, anyway, so we've already officially reached an anti-martial. Black can't play the martial gambit, so we don't even need to talk about the differences. If you remember, this position could have almost been a repeat of the Svidler Anand game, and bishop to b7 had been played. Not quite exactly with d6 move order, but either way, Svidler is avoiding those roads commonly traveled. C3, so again, if we talk about anti-martial, anti-Berlins, you recognize this structure as being similar to an Italian, and you can see why so many of the top players prefer this. It's just flexible, that's all. There's just different options. There's several different types of pawn structures you can reach in the middle game, giving your opponent more opportunities to go wrong, giving you more opportunities to out-prepare them from both sides. This is why this stuff is popular if you haven't been paying attention. Castles, bishop to c2, rook e8, all very natural developing moves. Rook e1, b4, knight b to d2, still pretty common stuff. The one thing, of course, Black has to either want to stop or be ready for is to move a5. But Svidler says, I'm okay with it, go for it. And Caruana says, all right, I'll do it. You've already seen me talk about the positional strengths of this move, right? It separates the A and the B pawn. It opens up the A4 square for the bishop. So I'm kind of a fan of White's structure here in these middle games. I noted that game where Alexandra Kostyniuk won very nicely against Sabina Foyser just from last November. So I think White has the potential for a little bit of an edge in a lot of these positions, gaining that space there. But, okay, G6 is played, and after bishop to B3, bishop E6, bishop A4, again, very common. You go here, force them to deal with the critical diagonal, now put pressure on the pin pony. This is very traditional Ruy Lopez stuff, very typical stuff. Bishop to D7 and knight F1. So I don't mean to paint the picture that White's totally winning either. I just think that White has a small edge, a position that they can play on for a win, and I think Caruana proved that here despite the mistakes. This is a tough position for Black. H6, knight to G3, B takes C3, B takes C3, bishop G7. We play H3, and Svidler feeling that he was a little bit worse. Again, White's piece is just a little bit better placed. There's an H6 pawn that's kind of under fire. He felt like he didn't want to let Caruana just keep pushing the small space advantage, where Fabiano's at his best, of course, with small advantages and clear plans. Although, isn't everybody at their best with a small advantage and a clear plan? I guess that's true. For example, if Queen E7, D4, this is an example of where White would get a small advantage and a clear plan. White has space. White has the E4 square. Black's pieces are clearly worse than White's if you just compare each one of them pound for pound. So this is the kind of position that Svidler said he didn't want in the post-game conference, and it's why he played the move D5. But we're going to see that that move should have backfired much more immediately than it did. After ED5, knight E4, knight to B8, bishop B3, bishop E6, already Caruana missed his first opportunity to really put the clamps down. And it's hard to understand why, because it's a pretty straightforward and kind of typical pawn sacrifice here, and it really would have just been irritating for Black to deal with. Knight to C5. If you don't take my pawn on C3, I'm winning the bishop pair in an open position where I can grind you. It's all night. It's Lionel Richie on this, right? All night long, all night. Anyway, so Black has to take. And after knight takes E6 with tempo, you can't take here because I'll take here. After you win my knight, I take here. You're down a piece. So we get queen to C2. The knight comes back to a pin square. I think bishop B2 is fine. I think there's probably other moves. I love this position for White. I love the pressure here. I love the potential on the C file. I love the bishop pair. Very, very tricky for Black. There's analysis at the news report you can check out. But that was Caruana's first chance to really flex the muscles of why I think this Lopez is a little better for White if we see it again, and why knight to C5 was the best move. Instead, Fabiano played the safer bishop to D2 to guard C3. And the tables actually started to turn. After bishop A4, F5 with tempo, and then C5, Fabiano admitted in the post-game conference that he kind of underestimated the individual move C5, but just sort of the overall plan for Black to be gaining this space, to have sort of a Maroczy-bind structure, holding pieces back in the center, making it hard for White to make breakthroughs. Of course, C4 would weaken a different pawn. And this is an important moment because here probably Svidler had the upper hand. Queen to C7, he brings the knight back to F6 to make a trade, which is only going to clarify his ability to make use of that space advantage, getting rid of that annoying bishop, the point is. And now Fabiano strikes back, though. This is key, because Fabiano isn't willing to be grinded either. He wants counterplay as well. Of course, we love the move H5 if you're thinking Black has to take with the pawn, because now knight takes F5 is, resign times for Black. That's just horrible. But Black doesn't have to take it. In fact, Black just ignores it and then takes it for free, without actually ruining any of the structure. In the process, yes, he's given up the E4 square, but probably Black was doing well here. In fact, after queen to C6, hitting the knight, and then C4, live game, this is already reminding me that it felt like Svidler had gotten the upper hand, that Fabiano had misplayed his advantage, and that very soon we would be seeing a very good position for Black. I think Black is half a pawn better here if you're asking the dragon, right? The giant Komodo lizard. Queen to D5, rook A to D1, but Svidler returns the favor, and that might have been one of the most critical moments of the candidates so far, the fact that Fabiano's still in it. Rook to c8 was best. Guard the c-pawn and then free up the queen to do the dirty work that she needs to do. Very hard to judge Svidler for not finding it under time pressure, but after bishop c1, you take it. Now you're officially threatening to take here because the queen is no longer tied to anything. So after c takes d4, we have rook over to c8. The main point is that if black takes right away, we get a big trade and white actually wins back the knight. So black only comes to the e-file now once it's open, and after takes e1, and then queen f7, followed by g5, the position is actually just better for black. It seems trickier for white to for black to move forward once the queen enters c6 in this line, but the a pawn is not being taken fast enough to justify black's kingside counterplay. So g4 is a move right away, and if black starts getting play on the king side, there's no way white has time to do everything that he needs to do to justify being down a pawn currently in the position. So this was probably what Svidler needed to do. Instead, he played the move rook a to e8, and now Caruana strikes right back. He takes e5, takes again, and wins his pawn back with a discovered attack on the queen. After queen to b5, we're headed to an endgame. But surprisingly, after a middle game that seemed like all of black's pieces were coordinated and you didn't feel like this knight was out of play, you felt like the attack was coming, right? You didn't feel like the rook was overextended on b5. You felt like it was doubling. Now there are tactics. This bishop's coming here to guard the pawn. There's tactics to take advantage of the overextended rook. As I just said, the knight on h5 doesn't seem like a very good piece, and white is actually suddenly better. Caruana said afterwards he wasn't sure how many winning chances he had, but he knew he had winning chances in this endgame. And after the bishop comes to b4, you see that black's pawns are pickable. They're like hanging fruit, whereas white pawns are not. It's one of those funny scenarios where a lot of times I think you hear people talk about the bishop with the pawns on the same color as that bishop is worse. And that happens to be the truth if the bishop is behind the pawn structure, right? If the bishop is blocked behind his own pawns, then that bishop is a less active piece than its counterpart, and those pawns are more likely to be targets. But when the bishop is perfectly positioned in front of your own pawns and using them to help anchor down the structure, then the fact that your opponent has pawns on the opposite color of the bishop is a huge disadvantage for them because their bishop is helpless when it comes to defending against very simple moves like rook to c8, rook to c6, and that's exactly why Fabiano Caruana got the upper hand in this endgame. He gives a check. He's just playing tickle here, but he's going to pick up that pawn, and you're going to see the a6 pawn fall with it in just a few moves. These pawns are weak because black's bishop, again, can't defend. So Svidler was surprisingly being put up against the ropes. The second pawn falls, and I'm going to be totally honest with you. When I saw this, I thought the position was going to be an easier win for Fabiano than it was. Although I admit I just underestimated how drastically awkward the rook is placed here. If the rook ever moves, we lose the pawn for nothing, right, as long as this file is closed. But the only way to stop that is to block the rank and then allow the exact approach that Svidler took in the game, which was to take and head for the rook versus rook and bishop ending. Now, I want to prepare you for the fact that I am gonna blow your minds in this endgame with some knowledge, all right, about the rook and bishop versus rook ending. And I'm also going to encourage you to go check out Grandmaster Joshua Ferdel's videos on Chess.com. Now, you have to check those out if you're not a premium member. Now's the time. He has two really good videos that show both the correct defensive methods that Svidler didn't take and the winning methods that Caruana admitted he forgot about, even having seen it so many times. The rook and bishop versus rook is, I played it 3 times with the rook and bishop versus the rook, and I've won all 3 times. So it's one of those endgames where, yes, it's a theoretical draw, but do not mistake, it is not a rook and knight versus rook. It is much harder to draw than it is to win, as evidenced again by the best chess players in the world. White should have won this game. So, first we're going to talk about the critical drawing method. One of the most important things to understand is black. These are all kind of typical moves. White trying to make progress, black trying to sit. Is the 7th rank defense. This is a very good move here for black. And take a big picture with your face camera. Cha-ching, okay? The key of rook to b7 is, why is this move not possible? This is not a king and queen stalemate. You can't sack on b6, but you can sack on c7. This is key. It's what Svidler was aiming for. This is known as the 7th ranked defense of the rook and bishop versus rook. If you can remember that this position, as scary as it looks, is actually a draw, you have much better chances. If I check, you go here, and if I check again, you go here, and you're like, oh, I want to win if I'm white. But guess what? You check, I go here. You go back, I go here. Now what? Again, if you enter, stalemate trick. Remember this. This is what Svidler should have been able to hold, but Fabiano played creatively and forced him out. Instead, after rook g8 check, did not repeat, but actually played bishop to c5, and of course didn't go for king c6 because of rook c7, as I already showed. So we get a whole bunch more moves here. Again, Fabiano kind of waiting on the 6th rank. It shows you how practical this endgame is. Have any of these moves unbiasedly improved white's winning chances? The answer is no. But they've created a new defensive setup for your opponent to figure out, and that's the first, mind-blowing practical tip. Don't be afraid to push on in positions. Who cares if it's a theoretical draw? Create new setups that your opponent has to be careful of all kinds of new tricks. Know the positions that are drawn, like that 7th rank defense, but keep putting pressure in the critical points and see if they crack. That's exactly what white's trying to do here. Don't blunder moves like rook to d6 and let him trade on d7. No, keep putting pressure. The bishop comes. The king comes around. The rook comes over. We're doing it again. If you're white, you're just trying to create pressure. Are any of these positions any closer to winning than they were before? Not really. Yeah, a very funny comment. I'm sorry, I had to remember that I wanted to mention that. That's why I paused. But here, this position is actually still a draw. And the easiest way to draw it again is to keep the king there and kind of keep the rook in preparation for the 2nd rank defense. Another way to do it, for example, would have been king a4, meeting king c4 with what? Chekaruski. But Svidler did not play the best move, king a4, which would have either attempted to run the king out on the light squares or the 2nd rank defense stalemate. And as was pointed out by Fabiano, and Svidler agreed, Fabiano purposely tried to put the king on the side of the board instead of directly in front of him. Because optically, it's harder for the brain to draw in the 2nd rank defense when you're flipped to the side. And Svidler laughed and said, I agreed. In fact, he considered asking, is he allowed to move his chair to the other side of the board? And again, that seems silly, but it's really, really important, even at the highest level, because after so many hours of chess, and these positions are not easy when every move you feel could be your last. If you don't have these patterns just so down pat, you can mess them up, as Svidler did here, and it got himself in a lost position. So the point is that Fabiano, from a practical perspective, and again, the tips I'm giving you is get your opponent on the side of the board. So what are the things we've learned? Always put pressure on different points. Know your opponent's theoretical draw. If you're the one trying to draw it, remember the 7th rank defense. That's pretty much your only drawing defense. Getting your opponent on the side of the board is just a huge practical victory. It makes it so much harder. And that's exactly what Fabiano did here. And because of that, Svidler was more afraid than he probably needed to be. He played the move king to b5, trying to play the most active king move instead of the 7th rank defense move. And that actually didn't help. Because now, as the rook flipped the script on the position, it actually got it got black in a harder to hold position. Now, okay, again, unbiasedly, is this position a win, even if you're threatening checkmate? No, black was still drawing, but white is getting closer and closer to having the king up against the edge. Bishop d6, of course, you can't trade rooks. Keep that king on the side of the board, bring the king forward, and now block with the bishop. Take a good look, everybody, because you know what this position is called? It's called the Philidor Win. Okay, this is a winning position for white. How do we go from a draw to a win? Again, because black gave up the 7th rank defense. It's not called the 7th rank defense when you're on the B file. Again, the optical swing, but it's the same technique, but black was able to be chased out. You don't want to be chased out of that defense, which is what Svidler allowed. And if you want to pause the video and be a genius, be my guest. You're not going to be able to solve the win here unless you cheat, use a computer, or whatever. If you want to impress people, that's between you and your own higher power, all right? But the point is, this is very, very difficult. And Caruana didn't even do it. As he said, I've seen the win so many times, I couldn't remember it. It's just kind of sad after so many hours of chess. So why is it winning? The bishop is in an optimal position, blocking off the rook from checks. The bishop also has the ability to play waiting moves that can guard the rook from checks. Okay, the rook would actually rather be here, amazingly. because of the light squares. And again, we've already talked about the 7th rank defense. But you're still not threatening anything. If you check, the rook blocks. So it's a combination of using the fact that this bishop is guarding, or has the potential to guard the key checks, and the bishop is guarding the escape square. So imagine if you come down, the king can't just run anymore because rook a1 is mate. The bishop guards the square. If this rook wasn't here and the king tried to run, this rook here is mate because the bishop guards the square. So remember that. In the game, the winning move was rook to b2, a waiting move that pretty much I wouldn't remember unless I just spent an hour and a half before this video analyzing it, swear to you. So, rook to b2. Now the rook has to come to h3. Again, if I run to a5, Czekalina la Szlamba, okay? There are no stalemate tricks here. So the rook has to come to h3 to guard this, okay? If king to a3, we're going to get a similar idea you're going to see. Now the rook just takes one more step, and you're threatening rook a1 mate. If the rook comes to h2, you go back to b6, and there's no way to stop mate. By the way, if the king runs, you check, and then mate on a1. Remembering now that the mate is... I'm sorry, I'm actually forgetting the mate for a second. The mate is after... Let's focus on the main line, sorry. So after rook... You see how hard this is? So after rook to b2, rook h3... Bishop f2 waiting move, guarding h4. Now the king comes to a3. It's even better for black here because the piece is uncoordinated. Rook moves over. You come back down. Again, this rook is going to have to come to h5 to deal with this checkmate threat. Bishop to e1, still keeping your eye on this. King to a3, rook to e2. Again, your threat now is bishop to b4 check, followed by rook a2 mate. And black has actually just lost. You can only sack the rook. Amazingly, by the way, this was only one move away from the 50-move rule. So, if the rook comes to h3, we saw how the king loses. Now, back to if the king was moving to a3 immediately, since you all want me to prove that, I'm sure. Again, actually, I'm sorry, I just forgot the easiest way to win. Rook here does win with the backdoor idea, but... No, rook here does win with the backdoor idea, but the point is, if I'm remembering here correctly, I'm sorry, I'm just tired. I just realized I'm just being tired. Rook to b6, you check, and then you just check and win the rook. Okay. So that's why the rook can't come to the second rank. And you see this pattern of the bishop and rook working together where the escape squares are guarded. So it's a win for white. And it's exactly the position that Fabiano was shooting for with all of his hard work. But once he got there, he was nervous. He was worried there weren't many moves left before the 50-move rule. And again, just didn't find rook to b2 and then the shuffling that needs to happen to put black's rook and king on the most awkward squares possible. Instead, he played the move bishop f2, which after all this work, couldn't he just get it again and have another chance to win? Yes, but there's such a thing in chess as the 50-move draw rule, which means if your opponent defends for 50 moves and you have not found progress, which is defined as a pawn move or a capture, okay? Checks don't count. Checks are for rookies, okay? A check is just a check, right? But a pawn move signifies progress or a capture. So you can't just try to push and push and push forever and let your opponent get exhausted. And as you notice, Svidler found his way back to sort of the 7th rank defense, and Fabiano simply ran out of moves here. He didn't have enough for the king and rook to be awkwardly misplaced, and after a few more checks, king d5, the position was just agreed to a draw because 50 moves had been reached. And so very sad for Fabiano to have reached that position and not be able to convert. But hopefully you will all go check out Josh Friedel's videos on Chess.com. Take a good picture of this with your face camera. Remember that you can get this position where the bishop blocks the king from checks. It's also ideally placed to hold the king from escaping. And with the right but waiting moves to get them awkwardly placed, they will not be able to guard everything. Again, I'll show it one more time. If the move rook b2 had been played and the best line, so not king a3, the rook here was guarding rook a5 mate, right? It was guarding rook from being mated. So the best move for black is, again, rook h3, which would be the best way to hold off the mate. But now we have this very brilliant waiting move. You guard the checks. make a waiting move, and there's no way to deal with bishop c5 followed by check and mate because your bishop helps it. Because of that, they try to run immediately, but now we have the move rook to e7 and bishop e1, and again, the threat is that we're going to be playing rook a7 and rook a5 will be taken and mated. So finally, when they move, you come back to the second rank, and there's no way to stop bishop b4 check and mate. No matter where they go with the king or the rook, you're getting check and you're mating. So just amazing, instructive for all of us, really good lessons learned, and we're not even at the end of this video yet. We got to take a look at the game of the day right now between Levon Aronian and Sergey Karjakin. Of course, full disclosure, as you already know, the man MVL has got the deep hookups, the deep analysis over there at the Chess.com news reports. Levon Aronian playing it again. The English again. MVL jokes that he knows that the English has been a huge fad at the candidates, but you can't really fault Levon. He's been kind of making it a fad by being the one who's played it most often and played it before the candidates. Here we see this open line again that I analyzed in last round's game. That was the game between, if I remember, between Peter Svidler and Anish Giri. Yeah, that was in the round 12 video. So we get this open reverse Sicilian type position, right? Reverse dragon. D3 being played here, okay, by Levon instead of A3, which was played by Svidler in that game against Giri. But similar plans, of course. You get A3 now, and again, you're going to get B4. It's a minority attack, right? So what you have is the 2 pawns versus the 3. You want to use the C file, create queenside counterplay. Black has the D file, the space that comes with that in the center. You're going to see this pony put itself on D4, try to get a transition of a Marco hop structure where the E2 pawn is weak. And see who blinks first, right, or whose play is faster. This is the battle. I've described it, and now we're going to see it again. F6 is played to support this pawn. Okay, that frees up the knight from moving. Also prevents things like B5 from being a concrete threat. After knight e4, knight to d5, the bishop comes back. Should be noted that bishop to c5, as sort of sexy as that looks to kind of induce the take and then the fork, doesn't really do much after I play b6 immediately, right? I don't have to take. And after you take, I can take back on e7 with either knight, but I think knight d takes e7 is simple enough. White has nothing special at all, and it's a good reason not to fill the c5 square prematurely. So bishop to d2, a5 comes in, and this is the counterplay that black wants in a lot of these Englishes where black has the reverse Sicilian structure, right? I've been talking so much about undermining early expanded queenside pawns in a Sicilian in my vote chess game, Master versus Many versus the World, which of course you can check out. A5 is just a very typical move. You're trying to expose the pawns who've left home so early and get them to overextend and become weaknesses. After knight to c5 takes, the pawn is a weakness, but white gets the b file to go with it. So that's kind of the counterbalance that's going on here. After a4, rook to b1, rook f to b8. Maxime points out that rook a7 probably was, I don't know if I want to say more accurate, but he would have had this other rook to do other things, whether that's the e file or the d file. So rook fb8 was a little strange. Maybe black thought he was getting more counterplay on the queen side than he actually got in the game. After queen to c2, knight to e7. At first, we looked at this position, we, meaning me and Gollum. Suddenly I'm referring to myself in the third person. But we looked at this position, me and my precious, when I first woke up early this morning to look at the games live. And I thought Karjakin had the upper hand. I felt really good about the bishop on b3 restricting white's pieces, and I thought that this pawn was going to be a target. But after king h8 and then the bishop moves, suddenly I realized that the knight's coming to d2. And this bishop is not going to be able to enjoy his Snickers, right? He's not going to be there for a while. And that changes my evaluation, where suddenly I liked white again. And after knight to b5, knight to d2, here it comes. Here, MVL pointed out that knight to d4 is possible. After knight takes, if white doesn't have anything concrete, then that knight on b3 is definitely going to be irritating. Though with the bishop pair and white's rooks being as active as they are, it's probably just dynamically equal. So, but maybe that could have been Sergey's chance to push on that point a little further. Instead, he retreated the bishop. And a good note is that if he had gone to d5, which kind of makes sense to hit g2, and maybe you try to induce e4 because that weakens d3. White would have had the common tactic that he had in the game, c6, really kind of a sexy move. Check this out. no matter how you take it. If you take with the pawn, then we take on e7, and then intermezzo bishop takes f6, and white's won too many pawns. This bishop is such a monster, not good for black. But if you take with the knight, now we take on d5 and then fork the queen and the knight, winning a piece. And if you take with the bishop, well, now they can take on e7 and then win 2 pieces for the rook. And white's better. So, yes, the c7 pawn will be hanging up if you take a3. So, c6 is a really kind of a cute little shot, which was instructive to me because I've never been really that familiar with the tactical patterns that white has here on the queen side in this line of the English. So that was interesting to see this c6 move and why bishop d5 wasn't possible. Even after bishop f7, we saw e3, and this shot of c6 comes in to be critical in the game anyway, right here. Black gets the counterplay you think he wants, winning the pawn, but white was allowing it because this shot was coming if indeed the pawn was taken. And after the queen moves, we move the queen, and suddenly black is under a ton of pressure because after b takes, rook takes, there's just so many pieces hanging. This knight is hanging. This knight is hanging if the queen moves anywhere. And it's not easy for black to even avoid tactics on the diagonal of the rook and the bishop. So he played bishop f7, and after rook to c5, this was the critical moment. This may be the moment that really defines the fact that Sergey Karjakin wins the candidates if indeed he's able to do so. The way he handled this position was exactly the way he's handled the positions where he's been under fire the entire tournament, as Maxime said and stated very well in his analysis. Again, rook to c5 was brilliant by Levon. It cuts off the queen's protection of the knight. I'm threatening to win a piece. Also threatens to take on d5. 2 pieces for the rook never hurt anybody. Under the fire that he's facing here, Sergey decides not to resort into passivity with a move like rook to b3, where he loses his pawn back and still faces a ton of awkwardness. The knight is under fire here. The rook is defending the knight here. There's also back rank checkmates in the air. Black feels the heat everywhere. So instead, Sergey decided, I'm not going to sit here and wait for the hammer to drop. I'm going to sacrifice a piece. And he took on e3 with the discovery on the queen, but it just gives up the knight. He just gave up the knight for free. Yes, he gets compensation in the form of the a-pawn, but that's a piece. And with best play, probably Levon should win, but what's amazing about this sacrifice is Sergey's just cognitive awareness of the fact that the a-pawn, combined with the weaknesses of the light squares, with his light square bishop, would be enough to make it really hard for white to handle this position under time pressure, right? He basically went Mikhail Tal on this and played a completely practical sacrifice, recognizing the tension of the moment, the practical difficulties white would face, and the fact that the a-pawn is a monster, right? And decided to put the pressure back on white instead of being passive, trying to defend, makes Levon find all the best moves, and it worked out brilliantly to hold the draw again when he was under pressure. After queen to d8, takes on c7, this moment right here is already probably the #1 critical moment. No, black cannot just queen here, okay, because white can take it and you can't take back. I get the rook check here, and you're going to end up losing the bishop on g8. But after bishop to g8 voluntarily, bishop to a1, rook to b8, white faces the moment that he needed to find in order to be able to win, that he was unable to do so under time pressure, and it's with the move that will surprise you. If you had to choose between rook to c1 or rook to a5, which one would you choose, right? Rook to c1, rook to a5, right? Finkel and Einhorn, Finkel and Einhorn, Finkel and Einhorn. Finkel is Einhorn. Rook to c1 is the move, and after rook to b1, you play rook f1. Seems strange, but this passive approach, next you get knight to d2, kicking the rook out, and then you can slowly start to work on blocking the diagonal where the bishop guards the a-pawn, keeping your d-pawn. In the game, he didn't choose the passive approach. Instead, Levon took the active approach, but ended up losing the d-pawn, and with it, all of his chances to win, really. With that d-pawn being lost, now the fact that black has just 2 pawns for the piece is enough to draw in most of these lines because of the obscured bishops, because it's just hard for white with no real weaknesses to attack and with a very difficult time winning the a-pawn to prove it. The game went on for a really long time, and I encourage everybody to go check out Maxime's analysis. f5 was good, separating the pawns, but I'm going to point out something. With the constant threats on the c3 bishop, I can take e4 and then take, or sack it if you move the rook off and then just get a queen. That forces white to play tickle longer than he wants, and eventually the threats on the bishop were enough that white gives in and trades rooks. And once the rooks are traded, that's that many more winning chances gone. This f-pawn is on a light square. So the game goes on for a very long time. I told you there were really long games today. That's why this video was long. That's why the day was long. But the point is, white just doesn't have enough to both keep an eye on the a-pawn, keep all the pawns on the board, and prevent black from liquidating the position. Black basically just goes back and forth here and waits for white to kind of figure that out. And Sergey eventually draws the position as there just wasn't enough, was not enough for white to hold. And that's going to send us into the review of the standings table, where I'm going to show you exactly where we sit in round 14, as white would either have to go this way and give up too many pawns on the king side, or just sit and we have a draw. And just mind-blowing right now what just happened there. If Levon wins that game and Fabiano wins his theoretical win in the Philidor rook and bishop ending, I don't know what we're talking about the last round. What we are talking about in the last round is what you see right here. Two players with 7.5 out of 13. That's Fabiano Caruana and Sergey Karjakin, and they play in the last round. By the time most of you are watching this video, they'll be playing and we'll know what's happening. Svidler is playing Anand. That's the other big game, because Vishy is only a half point behind. If Anand won as black and they drew, look at that massive tie. I don't even know what's going to happen. That's why we pay Peter Doggers to figure out that stuff. I don't have the energy to figure out what's happening in that tiebreak. You have games between Giri and Topalov and Nakamura and Aronian, but for all of those players, it's really just a matter of playing chess to have fun and finish where you can, because even if they win, if Nakamura won and got 7.5, the point is somebody has to win this game or at least draw it. And either way, everybody who could get 7.5, which is Nakamura, Giri, Svidler, Aronian, they're all on the outside looking in no matter what at this point. None of them can win the candidates, so it is down to 3 amigos. That's Anand, Caruana, and Karjakin. The round starts in less than 12 hours of me recording this video, because it's been a long day. I appreciate everybody for sticking with this entire candidate series. I know this is the longest video we've done so far, but that's because this may have been the most pivotal round. Depending on what happens in the final round, this may have been it. Fabiano's ability or inability to win that rook and bishop versus rook ending. Karjakin holding this endgame and finding the right moment to put the practical pressure and sacrifice the piece back. Vichy not winning the position where Giri made an unsound piece sacrifice. It's so many things, and it's just been amazing. I appreciate all of you. Please give it a like, give it a share, subscribe to our channel, do everything you can, and check out my last video from the Candidates Tournament, which will happen tomorrow after the final round. Peace out. I love you all. Good night and good luck.